Hey everybody, this is the Pacific PowerShell User Group, and today we're going to be talking about making microservices with Docker and PowerShell. But first, the obligatory, slide coverage. Pacific PowerShell User Group meets the second Wednesday of every month. You can please join the meetup. If you're interested in speaking, reach out to the organizers. And, every month we'll have a speaker and discussion topic. We will get into whatever fun topics beforehand. We'll broadcast and record meetups. You should be able to find them on YouTube when we're done. This month's topic is... Actually, I forgot to change that bit of the slide before I wrote this slide deck really quickly. So it's actually making microservices with Docker. But first, the basic who am I, in case you don't know. I'm James Brundage from Start Automating. I'm a former Microsoft employee and PowerShell team member. Currently an MVP in PowerShell and Azure. And I've done about 17 years of PowerShell scripting and counting. I dabble with a lot of technology, and today we're going to talk about one of them, Docker. Well, probably more than one of them, if I'm being honest, but Docker is going to be one of the through lines. So, this is a kind of stolen slide from an earlier talk of mine, which is rocking Docker with PowerShell, for forgiving me on that, but it's a technology we all dabble with, even if we do not know it. It is everywhere. GitHub workflows and Azure DevOps run in Docker. That is how they work. You can actually also specify your own image for them to run in. It's great. Most major sites use Docker for microservices. Hey, that's the subject of the talk. Most clouds support it. You can use it on Amazon, on Google Compute, and of course on Microsoft Azure in Kubernetes clusters. It's the basis of dev containers, which there was a great Research Triangle meetup about the other week by Joe Hughes. And those are supported in VS Code, and they give you a way to basically host your running code in an isolated container and develop. So they are a very useful trade craft to know. It's one of those kind of becoming fundamental to the way that we script, or the way we will script over the next, decade. So let's learn. Docker basics, extreme basics. Docker is an open platform for developing, shipping, and running applications. These are their words, not mine. I think that certain technical companies have a knack for overcomplicating what they do, and this sort of is that. I think of it as boxes. Docker deals with boxes. My words, not theirs. Docker calls these boxes containers, and they're not technically, but it's probably easier for most people to think of them as VMs. If we get into the little technical nitty-gritty, the difference between a container and a VM is essentially that a VM has hardware and a container is just, a file system that will go run, or maybe run. So what's in this box? Well, that's the first joy of Docker. Only what you put in the box. Like, only what you put in the box. Docker lets you isolate code, and this is kind of its superpower. Containers are cages, for lack of a better way to think of them. You do not have to trust things to run them. You can look in, and it can't get out. This is incredibly handy. This almost turns on its head decades of how we've kind of treated computing and security, because you can actually trust isolation in a Docker container much more than you can just hoping that some script doesn't touch any other part of the operating system, because to that container, the rest of the operating system doesn't exist. So you can choose what's in the box. Everybody kind of with me so far? Maybe already see a compelling advantage of these things? Quick show of hands for the people that are present. How many people have used Docker? All right. That's like everybody. I'm going to feel embarrassed. Okay. Andrew, did you have a question?
No, I just use Docker or know what it is.
Cool. And welcome one more person. So let's talk microservices. Having just covered the joys of Docker. And let's talk microservices. The cloud basically runs on Kubernetes and Docker at this point. That's what all of those links of, hey, here, run this in there, meant. It has that nice isolation benefit. This makes things safer, it's efficient, that makes things cheaper, everybody's happy, yada, yada, yada. If you're thinking about it old school, you can think of it as big servers that are hosting very small servers. And just because maybe it's catchy, maybe it, describes it accurately enough, this is why they're called microservices, right? So instead of having a big chunky box where everything needs to run, you're supposed to have a tiny little box where only the exact little thing you need runs. I'm not going to cover too much of it in this talk, but you can compose multiple microservices with Docker Compose into a single image. We're going to mainly cover kind of building one image and how you actually serve content from PowerShell in a pretty Spartan way. So we're going to kind of put the emphasis on the micro in microservices here. Also, this is probably going to be a short talk by my standards until we get into demo time. So in my opinion, anything small that serves is a microservice. At me if you really feel like this is not the simple, easy way to look at it. You can write them in any language. Let's learn how to write a small server in PowerShell. All right, listen up. You could write a server by hand. Like you could go and open a socket, like a TCP socket, and handle every part of the web request by hand. It
Who
would,
hasn't done that?
you
I mean,
know,
come on, let's be real. We've all done this.
I don't want you to do this. You should probably just use the built-in .NET class. I mean, you could. You are welcome to. If you are, somewhat masochistically inclined, you are more than welcome to handle sockets directly. But you could just go ahead and use the .NET HTTP listener class. That's system.net.http listener. We can go look at its documentation if you'd like, but I'm actually just going to show you the few lines of code that create a very simple server. And before that, we're going to talk about, the high level of how you do that. You add prefixes to a listener. That's what it's listening for. So if you have a prefix of HTTP : localhost 1234, it's going to try to listen on localhost 1234. It's going to fail because you have to be listening on a port over than 4,000, I think, for localhost. But, it's going to try. If you said, I'm listening on HTTP myservername.com / my URL / my subsegment / my other subsegment, that's what it's going to listen for. You can have many listeners on a box. You wouldn't need to. You should be able to do it all through one, but just add more prefixes if you need. By the way, any low rights user can listen to localhost, so it's not the main thrust of the talk, but you are going to be able to create a quick, ephemeral web server as a low rights user using these techniques too. That is, you're going to be able to create a web server that only lasts as long as you want it, whether you're admin or not. Sounds cool and scary. After you've added prefixes, then you just start. That's pretty much it. You get the context, which is basically nerdy speak for getting the context of the request, getting the information of the request and its identifier and what I'm going to send as a response. Get context, though, is a blocking call. So better yet, you could go ahead and get context async. Everybody with me so far? Maybe. Maybe not.
You
So far,
remember
yes.
you told us to mute, so I was saying yes, but you couldn't hear me.
Yeah. Well, that's what happens when, one mutes and one has hearing problems. What was that again? Sorry. So
All right,
this slide...
show me the better way to do it.
Oh, this isn't the better way yet. This is just covering the top to bottom. Simplest server we can write. Okay? Listener, new, add a prefix, start it up, while true, get that context, turn it into an actual variable, get or send a response, actually write the response, close the response, and we're done. So that's, I should have counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 lines. I mean, I'm sure you could crunch it all into one with semicolons if you wanted. You want to play PowerShell Golf on the shortest server you can write, I'm all for it. Just I don't think most security scanning tools will appreciate the effort. So, this is our most basic server. Can anybody spot what might be wrong with this server yet, or do we want to kind of run it and see?
Besides the typos?
Besides the typos, presuming that there are a few that I didn't catch. Yes? No? Maybe so?
Not sure I see a clean way to exit.
Ooh,
Like to
good
end
catch.
the process. Just while true.
Very good catch there. And also, let's go ahead and drag a thing over to this other monitor and prove the point. So here is our very simple server. And I'm going to go ahead and run it. And I'm going to go to localhost 9999.
Is this going to work if you don't fix the typos?
Apparently, yes.
It should. They're just variables. But...
I mean...
Oh, sure enough.
Yes, I see the typo now. Thank you. Okay. So, this works. Sure. I can actually rapidly refresh it. That sort of works. I'm kind of happy with that. Cool. Still working. Happy, happy, happy. Here's where it gets annoying and weird. And we're lucky enough that none of those requests actually hard stopped or threw an error in a way that would just litter the terminal, but that's pretty common if it's being hit rapidly. I just pressed Control-C. Is it stopping? No. Here's what I actually need to do to stop it. I need to go back to localhost 9999. And I need to try to make a request. And at that point, it'll stop. Which, I gotta say, from a pure security perspective, I think that is one of the most broken defaults that exists. Because it means if I was being DOSed and I was locked, then I won't unlock until you keep DOSing me. I don't know. This just seems wrong to me. So let's cover that's what's wrong with it. What exactly is wrong with that server? Covered the easy to lock the console. That also means it's not very fault tolerant. If, for instance, it stopped receiving results or the exception, broke out of the loop, then goodbye, right? So that's not ideal. It also would have problems, as someone had mentioned, when I try to exit the process because of that console locking. So if only we could make it run in the background, like, I don't know, in a job or something, right? Is that a PowerShell thing? That's a PowerShell thing, right? Yeah. we got start thread job. Start thread job, argument list, listener, and the exact same code basically produces a more reliable result. It also theoretically lets us have multiple threads listening. Cool enough with me so far? Do we understand how this works around that?
Looking good.
For extra durability, I can use the data added event on the job's output. And I can use the PowerShell exiting event to handle exit. And this is really going to be a record for me because I am way further along in the presentation than I thought I would be at this time. So, we don't like our basic server because it's hard, easy to lock, not as fault tolerant, but we can make it better if we do a thread job. And we can make that even better by adding a data added event to this job's output and using the PowerShell exiting event to handle exit. This is where we get to go into the fun of demo land, where the true fun of any given user group actually begins, and everybody can start to come off mute and ask all the questions and get all the answers, hopefully. I made a quick end-to-end example, as usual, of like 10 different things. You can find it at github.com/startautomatingdice. This is the first in a series of modules that I'm making to demonstrate, test, probability, and statistics. And there we go. It's over on the right side of the screen now. And it just lets you create virtual dice and roll them, as many as you'd like. It's so popular right now. I put it out this weekend. Now we've got these 2 quick lines here that should let us actually have a server for dice. And I'm going to go ahead and show the end-to-end, and then we're going to dive in. Okay. Clear that screen. Drop those 2 lines in. That was a really quick image to pull down because it doesn't have any dependencies, because what's in the box? Only the PowerShell core image and our module. And let's run it. Cool, it's got dice running, and I published it on to 6161. And I'm going to go to 6161. This is a very simple server. It is going to give me back random numbers or tell me no dice if I don't give it a number. So no dice, no number. And let's go ahead and roll a 6-sided die. I guess it does also make the text a little bit big. I'm probably, ignoring a few responses as I rapidly hit it and losing a bit of bandwidth for the joy of hosting. Let's also go ahead and pick an odd-numbered dice, any one that is unusual and exotic. Let's do, a prime number dice, 279. I think that's prime number at least. So very simple module, very simple service, and stable enough, quick enough. Okay. Everybody with me so far and ready to open up the hood and look and see how this works. Start to learn all the fun tricks at play. Yes, no, maybe so.
Was a prime number supposed to do something different? Because 279 is not prime. Sorry.
I'm sorry. No, prime number is not supposed to do anything different. I'm just picking a random number off the top of my head to demonstrate that it will create new dice on the fly and, show some of the fun going on. So before we actually get into any of the implementation, let me kind of show you some of the fun of how hosting this way gives you more access and context than you would have otherwise. So got the module loaded up into a variable called dice. I can go ahead and get dice to list all the dice. There's my 6-sided die. There are a couple ones that were automatically created but not used. I can go ahead and get, the 279 dice. Should theoretically have a chance of that. Let's see what my historical roll has been. Nowhere near. So I can also go ahead and look at basically the history of the dice here by looking at its roll table. And that's what it's doing. It's creating a little in-memory database to track all the rolls this every given time, and it's doing this in a context that both the web server can access and I could access on the terminal. So this is a little beyond the capabilities of, say, JavaScript or Python. JavaScript or Python is less likely to be able to have a event-driven service that can share data across multiple web contexts, and that's pretty cool. Now let's actually get into some code. First, let's demonstrate that this exits cleanly. Bye-bye. Okay, and let's look at our services here. Do we want to look at our Docker file first? Probably. Let me get back over to my slide. Maybe if I can ever get back over to my slide. Come on. I mean, I know the answer here. We do want to look at the Docker file and microservice, so I'm just going to go jump back in and deal with my slide later. It's going to be a quick enough talk as it is. All right. Opening up the Docker file. My box is taking its sweet time. This is a fairly well-documented one and a pretty standard approach. In fact, I've commented out some of the lines that I will commonly use in other Docker files. I go ahead and take a base image of mcr.microsoft.com/PowerShell. That's also kind of it. If I wanted to actually just have PowerShell code that I run in an image, this is the only line that I really need. That and telling it what to run when it starts, which we'll get down to at the end. The next thing that I do is I set an argument to contain the module name. The reason I'm setting this as an argument is I would like it to sometimes be configurable, and it will be used later on in the script to do things in a generic way. Another argument that I usually set is, installing packages, and another one is allowing you to install other modules. But for the purposes of this talk, we're doing this in pure PowerShell, or as pure PowerShell as we can muster. So, more commented out code if I wanted to install the packages. And this is the first joy of the thing. I go ahead and copy my module bits basically into the right spot on a Linux machine to run them. By default, this image is a Linux box. It's an Ubuntu image. So you can just put your PowerShell modules where you need them and call it a day. I'm doing this just for my own reference. I'm setting an environment variable indicating I am in a container. Naturally speaking, Docker wouldn't tell you this. We're going to come back actually to the container in a little bit just so we can see how little information Docker is going to tell you. And I'm going to go set my shell to PowerShell. No logo, and just run the command. Still shows the version number, and that kind of annoys me though. But hey. Next, I list out all these steps above because I am going to want to do this in a kind of weird way. One of the things you can do to make your Docker files slim is to have as few layers as possible. And if I did run this, run that, run the other thing, I'm going to have a lot of layers. And that's going to create a larger image. So that the way that I want to build as small of an image as I can is by basically creating one large PowerShell script that I'm going to run. In theory, you could do this by calling out to another file. In practice, this is the way that I'm doing it right now. I'm basically putting in the pipeline with a line continuation character, and any time that I have a command, then I'm separating with semicolons. It's an annoying pain in the butt. I will write a script for this one day. I will. I think I already have a few of them, actually. But that's the process. You're basically going through and taking your normal everyday PowerShell, adding just a bit to make Docker happy with it. First thing I'm doing here is I'm creating a profile, and I'm adding go load my module to that profile. And if there were installed modules, then I'm going to go put those in there too. I could take out these couple lines and be fine. I'm going to go ahead and add content to basically push into my module location. And then I'm going to check to see if there's a microservice file, and if it's there, run it. And this part's just for security and sanity. I'm going to go check to see if any of the modules had a Git directory. If it did, remove it. This shouldn't open up a security hole. What it should do is prevent you from accidentally having credentials or anything like that, or any sensitive information in your Git repository that gets exposed through the container. Does this sort of kind of make sense?
I got a question, James.
Sure.
What's the drawback of doing it all in these run lines? You mentioned the strength of doing it, but what are the drawbacks?
The drawbacks of doing this in this sort of stuff, this sort of format,
Yeah, because you
it's just a
said you
pain in
wanted-
the butt
you want to
syntactically.
avoid layers,
Yes.
right? You said you were wanting to avoid layers. If you baked most of that into an image, then it would load faster. Do I understand that correctly?
Yes, because every time you're doing a distinct run statement, you're basically creating a new layer on top of the last run or the last statement. So here's the base
Okay.
layer, and this is going to form a layer. I think arg will also form a layer, just a tiny one, but I'm not 100% certain on this. This will change that layer, and this will change that layer. And if I put this as run A, run B, run C, run D, then I'd have a layer and another change to that layer and another layer and another layer. So if you can have fewer
so by
layers,
putting them all in one command,
yep,
you don't get multiple layers.
I get one layer. That's the benefit.
Got it.
And the drawback of doing it is, again, it's a syntactic pain in the butt. But you should be able to just write your own script and call that. I'm sorry, I don't make all my demos as perfect as they can be on the first try.
That's fine. I was just trying to make sure that I understood that, because I got part of it. You don't want too many layers, because then they'll start to look like an ogre. And we know that ogres have layers.
Indeed. Although, this is actually a joke that has been made about Docker for probably as long as Docker has existed. Docker's like an onion or like an ogre. How? Because it has layers.
Yes.
I have heard that joke in too many Docker talks. And I guess now I'm part of the problem because I've just perpetuated it.
No, you left me with an open mic. It's not your fault.
I mean, you're helping to moderate, so it is.
Okay, fine. It's your fault. Moving on.
Moving on.
I did have one other question. So in your PowerShell command where you're doing the actual PowerShell instantiation, you had -command on the end. You might want to go over what each one of those does, because I'm not sure. There was one, the no logo I get, even though it still puts up the version. What does a -command do for you?
-command will run everything after that as a single command. So, yeah. What I'm basically saying is I want my default shell in this to be PowerShell, this, no logo, and any command you passed in. And the reason for this is general open-endedness. If you wanted to run this image with arguments of your own, like tell it to run a script, I don't want to stop you. Because it's your copy of the image. Like, let me make two parts of the security boundary here clear here. One is that Docker is, again, that constrained cage. So even if the image is hacked, there's not that much to steal. And the other important one is, generally speaking, for good or for bad, you are creating a container that multiple things will use and serve up. So it's not the container author that's being hacked. It would be the container runner, the company that is using the container, that would be being hacked. Does that sort of make sense?
It does to me.
Cool. Like, I'll go back to the GitHub thing for a second here, if I could get the right browser open, and kind of, show the point here. I have this package that we just pulled down. Great. Having this package is not hosting this on a live server at all. It's actually making it so that anybody could host it on a live server. But it just existing is no threat to my repository, to my code, to anything. It being used might be a threat, but it's very unlikely, because you can't crash PowerShell in the same way as you can crash Python or JavaScript. And unless you're writing a server that lets you invoke expression, you can only run what you let them run. So you can have a lot of commands on there. You can do anything you'd like inside of the server, unless you're allowing arbitrary code injection on the server. And unless the server is inherently unstable, Docker is more secure. Containerizing is more secure. Is this sort of kind of
Okay.
making sense?
It is, but I'm gonna now ask that you explain yourself when you say PowerShell is not as vulnerable as Python in order to crash it out in a container. So what do you mean by that?
I mean, a couple of things. One is, at a high level, PowerShell is a more inherently fault-tolerant language. That's PowerShell literally has a patent on non-terminating errors, right? And so if you have an error in your PowerShell script, PowerShell doesn't crash. Okay?
Okay.
That's not as true if you have an error in your Node script. Node crashes. If you have an error in your Python script, Python crashes. When things crash, sometimes, depending on how people write their exploits, that the fact that it's crashed at all can be used in certain contexts to run arbitrary code. Basically to say, this is what I'm doing to handle the crash. And that's where people actually get hacked. One of the places. Okay? So if PowerShell crashes, well, I mean, for one, you're going to have to try pretty hard. You're going to basically have to do things in PowerShell that directly kind of impact or affect .NET and cause it to hate you and die. And these are not particularly easy to do in PowerShell. Beyond that, for the vast majority of errors that would otherwise crash an application, they're just going to become a non-terminating error in PowerShell. And depending on how you handle them or don't, they're going to go off into the ether or get saved to a log. But what they're not going to do is bring your system down. And because they didn't bring your system down, congratulations, you aren't hacked. Does this make more sense now?
It does. Thank you.
Cool. So let
Is-
me.
I mean, the real reason that I asked that question, one, for my education, but also if you make statements like that, someone else will come along who may be more affectionate of Node or Python and go, hold up now. You can't just throw that comment out there and not back it up with something.
I believe that, freedom of speech affords me the ability to throw shade. But I
Okay.
could be legally wrong there. I don't mean to throw too much shade at, JavaScript or Python. They're both very good and effective languages. I also tend to think that, let's put it this way. If garbage collection is a good thing for most languages to have, probably so is fault tolerance. And I don't think it's really commonly discussed, but I do think it's one of PowerShell's strengths, that it is a very fault-tolerant language. Like, it's pretty hard to crash PowerShell without trying. Not impossible, but again, you're not letting somebody invoke expression unless you're being a fool. So, don't be,
Yeah.
as my grandfather said, if you're not going to be smart, at least don't be stupid.
That's a good one.
Yeah, it is. There's a reason that it's still quoted. All right,
Okay.
so we covered
Sorry
why.
to side quest
Oh
you there
no, it's
for
a
a
good
little bit.
side quest, and I've hinted at this a bit. We are on slide 11 of 12, so side quest all you want, because when we're done going through this, we're done.
Hey, I personally want to get back to the layering because if you do it enough times, it'll become easy. And if the layering is easy, then it's a piece of cake.
Where is a hat? Like a drum kit when I need one. Damn it. My timing on that one was all off, too. My retorts are normally better. Oh well. Let's go ahead and look at our little microservice file. Actually, I want to do a quick survey as we do this. What do you all think? Let me go back to the meeting for a second. Quick show of hands of who's here. Would you prefer a file with a unique name for each service, or that basically it becomes standard practice for every module that serves content to have a microservice.ps1? Raise your hands if you'd like everything to have microservice.ps1. Okay, and raise your hands if you'd like unique names. Okay, cool. Well, right now, I've been doing a lot of the things with non-unique names. At me later if you want. I have been generally creating a microservice.ps1 to represent the service itself. It lets me copy and paste my Docker files a little bit easier, if I'm honest. But it is something that is still evolving. This is yet one in a number of experiments to be able to do this in as little code as possible and as much elegance as possible, and I'm not quite where I want to be yet. For one, I could have some inline help here, but I don't. I just have a default listener prefix. And remember how we added that environment variable that said I was in a container? Well, if I'm in a container and my listener prefix isn't HTTP 80, then I'm going to go ahead and make it 80. Okay. So now we're going through those standard steps. If we didn't have a listener, we're going to go make one. We're going to go add those prefixes. We're going to do a thread job to start our server. Okay. We're going to be pretty nice about it too. We're going to try to start the server, catch that error, and return. If not, while true, yada, 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 yada. So we're just going to go right down the list, get the context async, wait for it, and return that object. Okay. Everybody with the code so far? So here is our actual background listener. Lines 25 to 43.
Hey, James, could
Yes.
you close the terminal until you're going to do something in it?
That's like the geeky version of crap or get off the pot. But yeah. All
No?
right. So next we're covering our exiting base. And we're basically saying whenever PowerShell is exiting, go ahead and close that listener. Quick note here, the reason I'm using global, don't at me over this, is that's the scope that both events and the main run space can see. I could use a script variable here too, but then the engine event would have to have that script variable. And there are a couple ways I could approach this, but this is easier. So this is one of my exceptions to the rules of PowerShell. You shouldn't use globals unless you really want it to be global. And one of the contexts you really want it to be global is if it's data exchanged between events. It's not the only way to do it, but it is a way to do it. We're actually going to cover the other way to do it shortly. So I want to go ahead and add that server, or add a member to the server job that says when I was created. This is just, for tracking purposes, even though I'm not actually doing anything with it, just trying to be good practice. I'm going to subscribe to the data added event. And that means every time new output comes from this job, I'm going to get an event fired. And remember, our job is returning the context or an error. Okay? Then we're going to go through one more hop. We're going to say here's our context, and we're going to create another event carrying on the message data in the time. And we're going to pass our job to this event. So this is every time output is added, we go create a new event with the job, the context, and the time it was generated. And honestly, again, not really using this or this yet. These are just things you might want to have.
Interesting.
Okay?
Curious why you're using an ordered array.
Because I really, really don't like my output changing because hash tables are unordered by default. I like my columns to be in the order that I expect them to be. So that's
you're
why I
willing
like
to
orders.
sacrifice the slight speed hit for that?
Yes, and if we're talking slight speed hits, adding hash tables is fast, yes, but not as fast as constructing a new object, in this case even. So if I was hard coding this, it would be a little bit faster. But, yeah, like at this point, we're getting response times that are well within the realm of acceptable. Like, I've generally get a response time between 30 to 70 milliseconds at the high end. Like, most of them are less than 30 milliseconds. Well, between 20 and 70 milliseconds, sorry. So, yeah, I'm pretty happy with the performance of this so far. I think it could probably be stretched a little bit further. I had one pure event service that was returning in like 0.7 milliseconds. But, most of the time, people will be just fine in the less than 50 millisecond range, especially considering that's like close to the industry standard / best of breed.
I'm just going to say, I love how you actually know this, and it wasn't just some throwaway comment.
Actually know what? Like server speeds and response times?
Like, the industry standard for response time is 50 milliseconds. So as long as I'm in the 30 to 70 range, I'm good. Thank you. Stop criticizing my code.
It's not even stop criticizing my code. You're welcome to criticize all you want. It's more like I'm not
Come at
trying
me,
to
bro.
humble brag too much on this topic, but I am very proud of the performance characteristics here.
No,
Like,
it's great. I love it.
I would already be proud enough if I could just throw together a PowerShell server in like a dozen or 100 lines. I would already be proud enough if it was safer to do that because of the crash handling of PowerShell than it was in an equivalent JavaScript or Python server. Good on both fronts. But the fact that I can do it as fast or faster, chef's kiss. So, going back onto the how, I'm going to go ahead and attach one more object to my server, which is the output subscriber. And I'm going to register engine event for the event that I just created up here, which is the HTTP request. Now, I could write this again 50 different ways. I could pass more or less information along each. We could just give hard-coded responses earlier up in the thing. We could query a table and return from that. Lots of different ways we can handle this. But, you know, this is the quick demo that I threw together. So, we take our context, we split it into the two variables we care about, request and response. And basically everything inside of our try catch here, which is about 30 lines, is our actual server. Okay? This part's probably going to be standard. Fun fact, even though it is no longer the 90s, every browser still asks for a favicon icon. Every request, every time. So when you're browsing into a website, you will actually be serving up two responses. One that is completely useless because favicon has not been paid attention to by browsers since late 2000s, like 2007, 8. I'm going to be a little bit wrong about this. But it's still asked for it. So yeah, you're probably going to want some variation of these few lines that says, I don't have a favicon, stop asking me. Because it will stop asking if you give it a 404, at least. At least it'll do that for you. Sorry, rant over. In case you can't tell, this has been annoying me for approximately 2 decades. This is the thing that used to...
used for the tab.
It used to be.
It's a little icon used.
It's
Is
not,
it not anymore?
It hasn't been used for the tab since they developed resizable, better icon resolutions. Because favicon canonically was either like 16 or 32 pixels.
Yeah.
And so it was just like, that wasn't good enough after, bandwidth started to not suck. So, Facebook's icon, for instance, I don't even want to imagine what that would look like in a pure 32 by 32. I'm going to guess not great. Anyway, that's the rant about favicon over. You will probably want a few lines like this. The rest of this is the DICE server. And this is nowhere near the best way to handle it. In fact, if we're talking simple, good ways to handle it, you've got a request query string. You can often just turn that into parameters. Okay? And I'm going to go ahead and say if my requested nothing, there's my no dice message. Otherwise, I'm going to go over each of the segments and find out if they were integers and return, a number of those numbers. So if there was only one, I'm going to read dice with that number of sides. Otherwise, I'm going to read dice with these two integer segments. And theoretically, the format custom would display them in a face, but that's been hit or miss for working. Otherwise here, I'm returning no dice. Then I've got to go take that output buffer, and the only thing the HTTP listener really knows how to return is bytes. So get it as bytes, return it as bytes. And we're done. And if anything went wrong, I'm going to turn that into a write warning, which will show up at the console, and not give me no sense of what happened, but not crash the application. And I think that's that. Oh, yeah, I got my little message that I spit out here. Hey, I've started a server. And then while true, instead of, waiting for something to finish and not having a cancelable prompt, I just wait event for PowerShell to exit. And
So, James,
Yeah.
right quick,
Sure.
the line 115 closing, was that the end of your monstrous script block?
Of which monstrous script block?
You were doing a script block.
66. So yes, that was the end of the monstrous script block. Monstrous at 40 lines.
Well,
I could show you
okay.
more monstrous.
No.
50
That was not
lines.
a challenge. That was not a challenge.
All right.
Could this be used to generate a really small REST endpoint
Uh-huh.
and maybe return JSON instead of text?
Yes. We didn't yet cover this, but you also can set the response content type here. So, you just say that. In fact, it's thank you, Copilot, for getting it kind of right for once. Anyway. But yeah, you just set response content type before you write a response, and then
Sure.
you're good. One of the other things that you can do with listeners that's less obvious here, but is pretty cool, is you can actually keep the response open too and keep responding. I wouldn't design most web services this way because that's not what you want to do in most of them, but it's a cool capability to have.
Very interesting.
So like if you wanted to make something that streamed back result after result after result, that is how. Way easier than writing that by hand. Trust me, I have looked at the W3C specs on this sort of stuff, and I don't want to. I just don't want to. I got better things to do with my life. Not that many, but, a few. So, yeah, you definitely could do this and just convert to JSON and be done. You're going to take a little bit of performance hit for convert to JSON, but kind of nothing quite like the value of being able to just throw the script that you have into a Docker image and call it a day. And, 30, 40 minutes of meandering later, that's really the point of things, is you can just throw your script into a Docker image and call it a day. Everything else is window dressing and gradations of quality. And part of the reason that I kind of came with this particular example was I wasn't trying to get into all the window dressing. I was trying to show something pretty bare bones. In fact, I might even say that I failed, because these, lines could be made shorter or put into the module itself as a script method that I can just call. And that is what I do in a lot of other modules. I basically build a serve method, and when a request comes in, I call serve. I'm done. Which I guess is as good of a segue as I'm going to have to the slide deck, if I can ever make it display on the screen again. That is not it.
That is a random number.
That is, indeed. I think, at least. It's
That's a
decided to
bug.
move over to this monitor. There we go. So, let's look at some other projects that are building out services. Probably the most flashy would be PSSVG, which I've demonstrated a few other times. A lot of these are in flight. I'm not done with them yet, partially because I am still wading through the topic of what the right thing to do is. So let's go over to PSSVG for a second.
If these projects are in flight, does that mean you're winging it?
Oh, totally, yes. Absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
I mean, I want to help everybody's imposter syndrome here, and you make it clear that everybody is winging it to some greater or lesser degree. People that think they have a great plan, what's the adage? If you want to make God laugh, make plans. So, yes, I am indeed winging it and working out the right way to do things as I go, and constantly evolving what that is.
I'm going to comment again about how I love you just straight man my in-flight and winging it joke.
I did,
I
and
do
also
appreciate
took it there in a way
I
that's
do
hopefully
appreciate
helpful
that.
to everybody.
I really love that about you.
Thank you. So we're going to go, pull down this shapes image and see if the demo gods are kind. I don't think they will be. I suspect everything was going to go wrong with my example, starting with me typing Docker pull twice. Cool, I already had that one, thanks. Docker run. Let's publish. Sure. And ghcr.io/start automating. Briefly, Docker does not like capitalization, which is a good thing to add to our case sensitivity training if we ever do that one again. So I'm going to go host my little SVG server here on port 6969 and get the world's ugliest example screen, hopefully by default. Yes. You know you have too many examples when your example that is a list of examples is too long to actually read. I'm going to need to make a better index for this one before I call it done. And until then, I will zoom. Actually, I will not. I will just go ahead and start clicking on fun stuff. Let's go for some repeated shapes. So this is what I get for zooming. So this is actually directly serving up back the file. I can also run the script and say side count is 4 and repeat count is 20. And I could give it a list of colors, but that's going to be too much of a pain in the ass. Let's go ahead and say shape type is rows. And this is all PowerShell that is generating and returning this content. Then SVG is just rendering it in the browser. Of course, if that wasn't already cool enough for you, in 3D is true, and 3D, or copy count, 3D is 10. Let's see how good or ugly this looks. Well, as a table, it looks kind of ugly. As a bubble, it's all right. As a sphere, it looks a little bit weird. As a helix, as a cube, and as a random set of positions, which actually is probably the prettiest of them. Again, this is PowerShell. I could also say this, 300, this is PowerShell. But yeah,
It's PowerShell, but how does that relate to the containers that we started with?
I am running a PowerShell module that produces SVGs and a service that returns them in a container. And you could use that container as a whole web server or as part of your web server.
Okay.
And it's completely isolated from everything else. Let's actually take it back to that topic for a second. Let's stop our script here, or rather Control-C it. I'm still actually technically running the server. Don't have that many modules loaded. This one has more than the other one. We'll go back to dice in a second. We're also going to go ahead and get child item env : not too many environment variables. So there's just basically nothing to steal. If I thought about this from a pure security perspective, as long as I have, say, a SAS token that can write out from this, then I can basically prevent you from doing anything other than sending a message in a bottle out. If that SAS token can only read and write to a table or a blob or an event queue, then your Docker container can keep sending information off to Azure to go and act on while running in a completely safe, different part of Azure. And most of the Azure resources, including Event Grid, you can also limit how exposed it is to the public internet. So, if I have a SQL connection string that can only read and write to a single database table, tell me, how are you going to hack the whole thing? The benefit of Docker is really in that isolation and basically distilling your scripts down to as little as they can be.
What's the memory footprint for one of these containers?
Ooh, that's actually a great and interesting question. Remember I said that they were like VMs but without hardware?
Yep.
Well, basically as much memory as you want to give them. So they're not going to use up that much memory, and you can limit how much that is. And especially inside of something like Kubernetes pod, if they go past that limit, it'll just reboot the box and start all over again. But you don't care because there's nothing on the box. The box's only purpose in existence is to do what it told you.
Right. So,
like if you've seen Rick and Morty's Meeseeks, Dockers are Meeseeks.
Right. I get that. But, if you're going to, if you develop something like this and you hand it over to a containers team, they're going to want to know, all right, how much resources are we going to need to allocate in order to properly deploy this thing? How would you determine how much you need?
Well, let's see how much we are using just doing what we did. Working set.
Should be pretty similar to if you were to just run it on bare metal, not in a container or a virtual machine.
Yeah, and I'm a little
tiny bit of overhead.
incredulous. I think that's the shared working set or the uncompressed working set.
Yeah, because you have to realize when you're running Docker, the OS is actually deduplicated. So if you're running 8 Docker containers, it only takes the space of 1 Docker container plus the differences between them. So it's extremely efficient compared to virtual machines where you've got 8 times the copies of the OS.
Yes. And according to that one, more than I expected, but let's go ahead and look at our dice one and find out. Because I think this one will be better. Because that one had a few different other things in it and tools, so let's go check this one out. Okay, so let's go ahead and get process ID PID working set.
I think what you're looking for there, Steve, is
there.
How in the container can you build in the monitoring to send an alert if you start running over so that you can spin up an additional container?
I mean, that's part of it. That's like a more advanced solution. I'm thinking more of the, how big is this thing at the onset and how much would I expect it to possibly grow as it's doing its processing so that I can give a lower bound and an upper bound to like a Kubernetes administrator and say, my container is going to take, 100 meg at the minimum, but it should never go over 200 meg.
Yeah, and
so
I would say
something like that.
A realistic, threshold is the lowest threshold that you can generally purchase on Kubernetes in Azure. This is it at bare metal start at about 173 megs. That is almost all PowerShell and .NET. Okay, and PSSVG was probably on the larger side of what you'd have as a footprint after fairly memory-heavy requests. Okay?
Yep.
So I have seen the instances that I run, which have about 60 domains on them, go between 200 and 500 megs. The lowest cost image is a half gig. And those are pennies. I have a combined bill for all of these things that is less than most of you have in your wallet now. maybe. I don't know. Cache has kind of gone the way of the dodo. So, when you have your change drawer. But yeah,
How many Satoshi coins is that?
I don't exactly know. I don't actually honestly know what a Satoshi coin is.
What is the smallest unit of measurement of a Bitcoin? And that's less than that.
Yeah, also please don't use this for Bitcoin mining or anything like that. That'd be annoying. I also think most of the major clouds are basically like set up to detect if you're trying to mine Bitcoin in Docker images and not let you. But what would I know? I'm going to go ahead and exit that one out. And we're mostly at the end of demo land, though I can go riff on as much as you'd like. I'm going to take us into the social slides. And then we can, stop streaming and start swearing like sailors. So docking should now be complete. Hopefully this has helped understand a little bit. Might understand Docker a little bit more. I personally, the last talk I gave on Docker, I said I was basically ankle deep. And at this point, I think I'm shin deep. I think there's still a lot more I can learn about Docker, and we can all learn about Docker. But I'm enjoying the ride a lot. And quite frankly, so should you. It's fun stuff. You might also see how simple services can be. Again, if it's small and it serves stuff, you got a microservice. You are welcome to ask questions, although, that's been happening. You can also follow me on GitHub, github.com/startautomating. Better yet, sponsor me. You can also follow me on Twitter at James Brew and at Mr. PowerShell on Please Mastodon, and Twitch. And that is the end of my talk. And I'm going to say goodbye to the broader internet and stop streaming and recording. Goodbye, internet.